Okay, so some people on Reddit and in my Twitch stream have asked me for my Escape from Tarkov video settings, and so I'm just going to go over that quickly in this video. Before I get into the settings, I just want to talk a little bit about the controversy that comes with Nvidia game filters. So this game has absolutely no contrast controls in the game, and most other shooters do. So if you look at a game like Counter-Strike, I can turn my contrast all the way up, and there's no reason to use a game filter. If BSG implemented something like this, I would much rather be using that because I don't like GeForce Experience installed on my computer in the first place. But I feel like in this game, this is a necessity. It really helps with visibility. Certain maps like Interchange and in some buildings on dorms and reserve, this is the difference between getting a kill and dying. So I'd highly recommend it if you're having that problem. This also would depend on your monitor, but if I flick over to the filter that I'm using, you can immediately see a huge difference in brightness and visibility. So I'm using details, brightness, contrast, and color, and these are pretty simple. Details, I just have clarity and HDR toning all the way up, sharpen and bloom at 0. Sharpen, I do sharpen in-game, and you'll see that a little bit later in the video, so we'll talk about that. Brightness and contrast. Contrast is down by 10%, highlights and shadows all the way down, and gamma plus 10%. Again, really simple, really minor actually. I think a lot of these guides, they go a little bit overboard in adding these filters, and it totally changes the way that the game looks, and I don't like that. I want it to look as organic as possible, but just give me a little bit more brightness, please. And then color, because those other settings are going to wash out your monitor and wash out the colors quite a bit, I just turn the vibrance up further. You could turn this all the way up to 100, I guess, and this just depends on personal preference. It's just how colorful you want the game to be, and if it's too overwhelming, you can turn it down. I do play with digital vibrance all the way at 100, and I've been playing Counter-Strike for 10 years with those settings, so I'm just used to the monitor being very colorful, and I want to keep that same feeling. So go to settings, and my in-game settings, I have auto RAM cleaner on and use only the physical cores on. If you're using a hyper-threaded Intel CPU or a Ryzen CPU, this checkbox is very, very important. FOV is very controversial, but I play at 75 just for the record. Graphics, this is very straightforward, very simple. Screen mode, full screen, screen resolution, whatever your native is. Just make sure VSync is off. Just a note on screen mode. I have played with borderless and I have played with full screen. Since the last patch, I've noticed some kind of inconsistent input lag when I'm using windowed mode, or borderless. And that could be from a number of factors. It could be other software running on my computer, but I would just keep it at full screen if input lag is noticeable. Texture quality and shadows quality, you bump these up a little bit to increase load on your GPU, and everything else is basically turned off. Visibility, you can play with this. This is more of a CPU bound setting, so depending on your CPU, you could turn this up higher. I find the sweet spot to be 1500, but I played with 2000 as well, so you can switch this around. I don't think you need much higher than 2000, so 1500 or 2000 is good. If you're playing on a low-end CPU, then dropping it down to 400 is probably ideal. Shadow visibility, I keep that all the way down. TAA, and then everything else off, except for sharpness, which is turned up to 0.9. I believe the standard or the default is 0.7. Down at the bottom, you want to make sure all these checkboxes are off. When I first started playing the game, I didn't even know these were on, and I could not figure out what my, why I was getting such bad performance with a mediocre PC, decent PC. GPU is getting old, but besides that, it's fine. So turn these all off. You don't need any of them, and they just have a huge impact on performance. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the Nvidia control panel and a couple of other optimizations I'd recommend. So open up your Nvidia control panel. If you have an AMD graphics card, then this menu will look different, but you should have a lot of the same settings. So just to quickly go through this, this is a very standard setup that you'd see for Counter-Strike. You'll pretty much see this setup in any Counter-Strike optimization guide. My main game is Counter-Strike, and I like to have the most competitive settings in that game, so I just copy them over to every game. A couple of things that you can play around with in here are the low latency mode. You might try on, off, ultra. That's going to depend on your settings. The important ones here are power management mode, prefer maximum performance, and preferred refresh rate. You always want to make sure that's highest available. And then this texture filter and quality should always be high performance. So this is pretty standard. Again, depending on your GPU and the games you're playing, low latency mode can change. There's some good articles about this and what it actually does. This used to be a setting called the flip queue, which you could adjust in Nvidia Inspector. Now it's called low latency mode, and it's available to us in the Nvidia control panel. A couple driver versions ago it had a different name, but basically you either want this to on or ultra. Some games you actually get more input lag with it on, so you can read about that. But for me, I just keep it on, and I don't notice any input lag. The other thing I want to show here is my monitor settings. So I'm using an Acer GN246HL 144 Hz monitor. It's old, it's not the best monitor. It does have a TN panel. So these are the settings that I'm using to kind of correct some of the color. I turn the brightness up by 5%, I turn down the contrast by 5%, and I turn digital vibrance up to 100%. And this seems to get really good color for a TN panel, and things are really bright. So I like this a lot. If you have an IPS panel or a VA panel, then your settings might be different. But if you are using a TN 144 Hz monitor, I'd recommend trying something like this, especially for a game like Tarkov, where it's a beautiful game, the graphics are great, you want to make sure it looks good. If you turn this digital vibrance down, the colors just look awful. So I would keep this the way it is. And again, you can play around with this a little bit depending on your monitor. The next thing I want to show is some optimizations you can do on the application. You're going to go to Properties, Compatibility, and disable full screen optimizations, change high DPI settings, high DPI scaling override, check that and make sure it's done by the application. This is pretty standard for pretty much every FPS game. Can't go into too much detail about what this stuff actually does, but it could potentially make a difference. It's going to depend on your system setup. Some people don't notice any difference at all. Some people say that it gets rid of stutters when you're ADSing. It won't fix your ADS frame drop, but I do this on every game that I play. Rust, Counter-Strike, EFT. So just go ahead and do it, especially if you want to fully optimize your game. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is process lasso. So this is really only applicable for Ryzen owners, maybe some Intel i7 users that have hyperthreading and 8-core CPUs or 6-core CPUs. But what you can do here is you can set the affinity for a certain application. So I don't have EFT open. I'm just going to use another program as an example. We'll take Discord for example. And if I go to CPU affinity, always, I can check off which CPUs are being used. So for Ryzen, I know that the 0 and even numbers are physical cores, and then the odd numbers are logical cores. So you only want to be running your game on 4 physical cores. So that's going to be CPU 0, CPU 2, CPU 4, and CPU 6. Just uncheck everything else. And then Process Lasso will identify when your game is running on more than 4 of those cores, and it should automatically pull it back down to 4. If for some reason this isn't working, some people have suggested that you could save the game settings in EFT and it will correct it. I've noticed that a couple times, but for the most part, Process Lasso does its job. I'll have a link in the description for a Reddit post explaining how to use Process Lasso for Escape from Tarkov. It was really helpful to get it set up the first time around, so you can read that thread if you want to use Process Lasso, if you want to try it out. I'll also post a link to Panchno's Windows OS optimization guide. He does a great job optimizing Windows 10. I think that could be really helpful, especially for people who they just want to optimize their game, and sometimes they don't even think about their operating system having any performance hits. So I would recommend that. I have 2 gaming computers in my office, and I have them both using his OS settings. So I would definitely recommend checking that guide out. I stream on the weekends at twitch.tv/therealbigbuds. I'd really appreciate it if you guys came in, hang out for a little bit. We have a lot of fun over there. So feel free to follow me, subscribe, do whatever you guys do. And I would really appreciate it. So thanks so much. Please leave any comments if any of this stuff helps you, or you have any questions about what I've done here, or if you have any other ideas for optimization, feel free to leave a comment. Let me know. I will reply to all those comments. So thanks so much.